Hey, friends. Welcome to Dishing on Divorce on WGSN-DB, Going Solo Network Radio, Podcasts, and TV. I'm your host, Lisa Lisser, CEO and founder of LZL Coaching, a boutique coaching firm focused on divorce, relationships, and life transitions. I'm also a divorced mom of 3 now grown kids. I blend my past experience as an attorney with my training as a spiritual counselor and my personal experience of divorce to hold your soul as we build your divorce strategy. We build a plan that's specific to you. Think of me as your guide on the side. Ultimately, my role is transforming the divorce experience for everyone involved. So let's talk. One of the biggest challenges in the divorce process is time. Everything takes so much time. Deciding that you need to get divorced takes time. I'm told that it takes 2 to 5 years for someone to reach the I'm thinking about divorce till I think we need a divorce conversation. Accepting that you have to get divorced or that you are getting divorced takes time, especially when you're blindsided. And then once you finally begin the process, you have no idea how long it's going to take. It takes time, a lot of it. My guest today is Justin Milrad. He envisioned something different, and he and I decided to join forces to build something new, something we call the 3-day divorce. And we're going to talk about that today and how you can begin to set yourself up to make your process shorter, more manageable, and less frightening. And you can be friends at the end. Yeah, you heard me. So, Justin, welcome to Dishing on Divorce.
Great to be here, Lisa.
It's so good to have you. So I'm going to give a little bit of your bio, just a little, and then I'll ask you to share more. So audience, Justin Milrad is a visionary entrepreneur, author, and certified divorce coach who helps individuals transform pain into purpose after the upheaval of divorce. As the founder of Reclaim and Reboot, Justin guides clients through one of life's most emotionally and logistically complex transitions, offering the tools, structure, and support needed to reclaim your identity, rebuild your confidence, and reimagine life on the other side. So Justin has also got an MBA and he's a financial advisor. He has all the tools to help you get to where you need to go. Justin, tell us a little bit more about who you are, your
Ab-
background. What?
ab- Absolutely.
Okay.
I have done many things. I've lived many lives. What's really interesting is this is the last thing I would have ever imagined doing in my life, but divorce shook it to the core. And, as far as my background, I've worked at many different businesses in many different industries. I worked at Home Depot for the corporate office. I worked in the apparel industry. Ran a family office. I'm the kind of person who likes to find something new, something interesting, add value, innovate, and then build it into a platform. Most recently, my ex-wife and I started a mental health and substance abuse treatment practice, here in Atlanta. And it was something that I'm so passionate about. And we had, a marriage that everyone wanted. We were in sync. Life was good. We were successful, and everything was great until it wasn't, and it all kind of happened during COVID. And the process, when we finally decided to get divorced, originally we said we wanted to start amicably, and then the attorneys got involved. And I'm not dishing on attorneys because they're really important, especially for more complex, estates. And ours kind of turned into a fight and it became a war. And then, I don't want to mention how much money we spent, but it took us 3+ years. We did an 8-day jury trial, and it was probably one of the most awful experiences in my life. Fast forward, I'm really happy to say that my ex and I are now friends. We are co-parenting extremely well. And I think this all kind of happened near the end where I learned about divorce coaching. And I learned that there was a better way. I learned that there was a better team. And I wanted to make sure that I helped other people go through this process quickly. And I think one other thing that I noticed, as I started to develop this new community, I met a lot of people who spent 3 or 4 years getting a divorce, and then it took them another 5 or 6 years to get past divorce.
Mm.
And I'm thinking to myself, the average male lives to 76 years old. The average female lives 82 years old. Let's say that we're in our 50s. That's a lost decade, and so much can happen during that time, especially if you have kids. So I wanted to be there. I wanted to be present. I wanted to enjoy my life. And while I don't love the fact that I had to go through a divorce, it was necessary. And on the other side, because I worked with a divorce coach and I kind of focused on my version of you 2.0, I am much happier on this side. So one day, Lisa and I were chatting and we were reminiscing. Reminiscing probably isn't the right word, but we were going back through our journeys, which are very traditional in nature. And that's kind of what we're taught, call an attorney and let them do everything else. And we were thinking to ourselves, there's got to be a better way. And that's where the idea for the 3-day divorce came up.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And so much of our lives sort of crossed paths and paralleled each other, not in exactly the same ways, but we started out with the traditional life where we married young, we pursued our careers, we had the kids, we did all of the right things, and we looked like a great family. But inside, something was eating away, and we had to make that hard decision. And for me, it took a really long time, but I guess you and I connected during my process of recovery because I was in the recovery space. I was training as a spiritual counselor in addiction, and you and I crossed paths there when I reached out to you about the Blue Dove Foundation. Fast forward another 2 years, and we're both divorce coaches, and we're trying to figure out how do we transform this platform, the platform of divorce, just like you transform the platform of recovery. Because when recovery is compassionate, there is a difference. When recovery has spirituality embedded in it, it's different. And it has more chances for success. And that's what we were looking at when we're saying, hey, this doesn't have to take 3 years. My divorce took 3 years. It doesn't have to take 3 years. It could be shorter. Like, what if it could be 3 days? And what does that look like? So I'm going to go there right away. Tell me, what was it about 3 days that became sort of your catchphrase? That was like your mantra in your head. You knew it could work. So tell me where that came from.
When I was really reflecting on divorce in general, I was thinking, divorce is not a funeral, it's a wake-up call. And what does that mean? It means you have to do a lot of hard work. There's a lot of process and things you have to do in order to get divorced. And once that's done, that's really where the hard work and the exciting work begins, which is the U 2.0 version. And, when I think about things like therapy is really, really important, but it's a slow drip. And people make progress, incremental progress. And then I look at programs that I've gone to that are immersions. And, when you go through these immersive programs, we all have friends who've gone away for 3-day retreats and they come back as a new person. And I'm like, why can't we do this with divorce? Now, in all fairness, you don't start on day one and you're not divorced on the third day. There's a lot of prep work, which is necessary. As I look back to the amount of work that I did from a preparation standpoint and the number of meetings that I had with attorneys and financial advisors and everyone else, there's 100% opportunity to condense that. Many of these professionals charge on an hourly basis. So, the best model for them financially is to enumerate as many hours as they possibly can. But when I actually think of the effort involved, it wasn't really that terrible. When I was working on my marital balance sheet, I started in the morning, and then 7, 8 hours later, I had something really solid. And once you have your marital balance sheet together, you're at a really good point to start discussing about division of assets. And the other thing I kind of noticed, and you and I have talked about this, is many people spend so much time wanting to be right, to prove someone else wrong, or the gotcha moments, or if he or she did this or that they would get more. But ultimately, what we learned was the law is the law. It's either 50% or it's equitable. And we can try and do as many things as we want to change that outcome, but in many ways, that's the North Star and what the likely outcome is going to be. So, does it make sense to spend, all these tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or even possibly millions fighting each other when, you have many of the same, interests in terms of the divorce? Let's try and get through this without hurting each other. Let's try and come out as unscathed as we possibly can. We care about our kids. We want them to thrive and be successful. And I want you to have a good life, when we're done. So 3-day divorce isn't for everyone, but it's for people who want an amicable outcome, and they really care about their kids, and they want, each other to be okay on the other side, and they want to move through it quickly. And it's that simple.
Yeah.
We don't overcomplicate things.
So let's start at the end, because there's so much packed into what you said. We don't overcomplicate things. I think that is key. Divorce doesn't have to be complicated. Like, sure, there can be complicated financial scenarios. There can be businesses that have to be valued. There can be assets that have not necessarily been transparent. But what we suggest is that you take everything and you are completely transparent and clear. This is the marital estate, and let's be honest about it. So we're not looking for people who are thinking, well, if I hide this, I have to give them less. We want people who feel like, I'm going to be true to my values. Because part of what I also want to share is that even if someone is hiding something, that doesn't mean that they don't have values. They just might not be living their values at that moment. So I'm going to say that, which might be controversial, but I think that sometimes our worst selves show when we're going through the process of divorce, because divorce is financial, but it's emotional. And there is jealousy, and there is anger, and there is selfishness, and there is fear, and there is uncertainty, and there is grief. And all of these things often prevent us from being our best selves. And, that's sort of like a catchphrase that I learned in divorce coaching, but you can be your best self even when you're going through a really hard situation. You just have to decide that's who you want to be. And one thing I wanted to share with you was that you use the word amicable, if you want to be amicable. And I am challenged by this word, because it suggests that you're friends. And there's a difference between being family and being friends. And I would say, let's be focused and let's be clear. And if you want to be focused and clear and get the best results for your kids, that's the ideal client for our 3-day divorce. Even if you don't feel amicable, if your value is that you want to get through this with the least money wasted on unnecessary services, let's do 3-day divorce, because you get the finances cleared up front, and then you start working on all of the pre-work, which is, how could this look in another scenario? So I see you have something you want to say.
Yeah, the amicable conversation's an interesting one, because you're not going to leave as friends. We want you to be friendly. We want you to be respectful. We want you to have integrity. You build your relationship over time. But what you're going to get in the 3-day divorce is you're going to come up with, we call it a memorandum of understanding. And part of that is about division of assets, but the other part is really about how do we work together. And, if you have kids, which many people do, you are now business partners in your kids' lives going forward, and that's never going to change. So if we do this right and we have, boundaries and agreements, and we have some of the hard discussions in a safe place, then you move towards amicable.
Yeah.
And over time, you might just be friends.
Maybe
that's not a bad place to be.
It's a possibility. But I think this idea that amicable is a word we use to describe a state of mind, maybe not really, how your heart is feeling at that moment. Because no matter how good you want to be about the process, you're still hurting. So
For sure.
the safety of the retreat space is what we've talked about trying to create, making sure that retreat is in an environment that holds people through this hard stuff. So how did you envision that when you first had this idea, like a retreat, like these immersive experiences, we know they're life-changing. So what does it mean if we're going into an immersive experience to separate?
So, we talked about a lot of the pre-work, and, grief does have an expiration date to it. So, in the pre-work, we talk a lot about the mindset that you have to have going into this, because if you don't have the right mindset, and if, we determine early on you're not the right fit for this program, then it's not going to work for you. And day one is really focused on acceptance and understanding. And it's not fighting with your ex, if one of you doesn't want to be together anymore, then the decision is made. So it's about how do I accept it, how do I understand it, and then what do I do to move forward. And I think that's really important, and that's where a lot more of the emotional unpacking and trauma discussions come out. On day two, it's more about clarity and communication. And this is just facing the brutal facts of, we have a marital estate on the financial side, and now we're going to split it. And, agreeing to many of these things, which, also some of this is resolved in the pre-work. And then also really talking about the importance of being strong co-parents and what that might look like if you have kids. And then, day three is really about action and new beginnings. And that's like, how do we move forward? And this is less focused on the couple itself and more focused on the individual. And this is about giving you a pen to write the new chapter. What do you want it to look like? How am I going to focus on my mind, body, spirit, and soul, and how they interact? And it's a beautiful thing. And like we said before, you walk out with a memorandum of understanding. Our expectation is that, 95 to 97% of the things are going to be agreed upon. And then, you go to a lawyer and you paper it, and then you finalize it. And there's great opportunities to work with, said professionals after the program, should you want to do that.
Yeah. That is a great overview. But at this moment, we're going to take a 30-second break to hear from our sponsors, and we'll be back and we'll dig into the weeds of how we do the work in 3-day divorce. And we're back with Justin Milrad. the author of You 2.0 and its accompanying workbook, which is also part of the foundation of what we do at 3-Day Divorce. Justin recently published this book just a couple months ago, and the workbook just a couple weeks ago. You can get them both on Amazon. And they're great because I was one of the early readers, so I can attest to that, because Justin shares stories as well as practical tips. And we all know that we get to know people through their stories, and we get to know ourselves through other people's stories. And that's a big piece of the power of You 2.0. What I also wanted to do right now, Justin, is talk about that day 2, that middle day of the retreat, where it's not just establishing the assets and liabilities and how we divide them, but we're also talking about support and what spousal support might look like and what child support might look like. And these things feel like that's just too big to decide in one day. So, can you talk about the pre-work that we hope will get our people to that point?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest question coming from both spouses when you decide to divorce is, am I going to be okay financially? So many people don't know that answer until they actually put pen to paper. So a big part of the pre-work is doing a personal budget. And really that's taking real numbers that you currently have and figuring out, what's your monthly expense, what are your monthly expenses, what are wants versus needs, what would you need to move forward, and what are your income sources and such, so that you have a grounding of your reality moving forward. So there are instances where, for example, one of the spouses stays home to take care of the kids, and they have certain wants and needs, and they put that in their budget, and they'll see that their localized support calculation doesn't give them anywhere near what they want or they need. So they can negotiate that, but the law is the law and it's unlikely. So sometimes there's a difficult conversation where you may have to change your lifestyle, or you may have to go get a job. So that's one part of it. Then another part is we do a marital balance sheet. And I think what's really important about the marital balance sheet is no one really knows, unless they're likely an accountant or a financial planner, how much money they have, what their assets are worth, what their liquidity is, what is considered a premarital asset. So there are certain items that a spouse is not entitled to if it's premarital, or if it's, for example, of course, different states have different laws. Sometimes a personal injury, lawsuit settlement is not considered marital property, and inheritance and such. So, we put this all on paper. We can also do different scenarios for scenario planning. What does 50-50 look like? What does 40-60 look like? And we have these discussions with the individuals. So on the second day, they don't see it for the first time. And they likely already have some of the answers in place. Maybe you get the house, I get a payout over 10 years. You get to keep the Lexus, I get to keep the Mercedes.
If you're lucky, right?
If you're
That's just
lucky, and then we have this big asset that is not easy to move. And why don't we put it in the kids' names? So these are, it's really an opportunity to talk and be creative. And then I think the other things that are really important in the pre-work is, for example, if if they agree on the house and one spouse has to assume the mortgage, we give them some advice on things that they need to do to make them assuming the mortgage more likely. And these are questions that I wish my attorney talked to me about. When it came time, for me to buy a house, even though I had the liquid net worth, I didn't have the income net worth because my divorce was a full-time job. And had certain things being told to me 3 years earlier, I could have made some arrangements to show income, and getting a mortgage would have been a lot easier. So,
yeah. But
Which
so
is
what I
great advice.
yeah, and what I want to share is that when we talk about the pre-work, um, our 3-day divorce is not just 3 days. So we're going to have like a 6 to 8 week prep where you do that pre-work, but you get support from Justin and myself and some other professionals in finance, in real estate, where we have the connection so that it's really a one-stop shop, right? You don't have to worry that you're going to have to find all these different people. We're going to help you know who all the different people are in terms of their roles. And then you get to get that help on the way toward the retreat so that you really feel prepared. So much I found about my divorce that was scary was the fact that I didn't feel I knew what I needed to know. And the prep work for the 3-day divorce is where you're going to learn what you need to know and you're going to get information so you can make some decisions. But you'll make those decisions face to face. So, as I'm trained as both a mediator and a pre-mediation coach, I can help you find your 3 different scenarios that are possible options when you come to the mediation table. And that's part of where you'll go during the 3-day divorce process. So the hard work really happens in day 2, which is a long day. And then we get sort of a rejuvenation on day 3. What would you add to that, Justin?
I think the pre-work is absolutely critical. And one of my favorite exercises that we do is finding out what are the fears. So, there's so much unknown going on and you're scared. And, I love using the acronym false evidence appearing real. So, typically when we walk through these fears, we use these different frameworks, for example, as evidenced by. And, what it does is it really disarms people and, it takes them from a fighting mode into more of a collaborative mode. And, in some cases, they just want to get this done. And, there are certain things that they can find out from their spouse or that we can coordinate in terms of conversation where they, one person may have thoughts that the spouse wants to do this to them, and you talk to the spouse and they're like, that's furthest from the truth. So, in the pre-work and the time that we spend with the spouses both together and alone, we're able to help resolve a lot of these issues so that you can show up to the 3-day divorce retreat disarmed, ready to work, and ready to move forward. So I think that's super important. And then, we also have resources at the retreat that if things do get heated, we have a way of, calming it down and, getting back to what's most important so that we can move forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's really powerful because we have a true beginning, middle, end in the 3-day process. And the end is really just another beginning. I mean, the quote I have at the beginning of my chapter in Divorce Decoded is, every beginning is another beginning's end. So while you're ending your marriage, you're beginning this next phase of your life. You're beginning the business relationship, the business partnership in raising your kids. And part of what we also offer is the opportunity to do workshop in becoming business partners in the business of raising your kids. So I'm trained as a BEO, BEH2O collaborative co-parenting coach. And we have a whole curriculum where you learn how to be parents together with a different mindset, where you're looking outside yourself, where you're considering everyone's perspective, not necessarily because they deserve it, but because your kids deserve it. And your kids deserve knowing that their parents are not going to be in conflict. And that's the whole point of 3-day divorce, is that we want to leave and not continue the conflict. Today I would say that my ex-husband and I are on great terms. Our children are in the getting married phases. We have holidays together. But 10 years ago, when we got divorced, it wasn't so happy. And it took a lot of years to learn how to get used to this process. But we always had our eyes on what's best for the kids. So we tried to do what's best. And I think all parents try to do what's best for the kids, but they sometimes get in their own way and they aren't able to achieve it because they're so married to the fight. So this 3-day divorce helps us divorce ourselves, not just from each other, but from the fight we have with each other. So how do you see that?
There's some evidence-based research that says it's not the divorce that destroys children, it's how parents handle the divorce that destroys children. So, typically when, someone files for divorce, and I'm not saying all attorneys, but many attorneys, just from my own experience, really what they're focused on is the process of getting the divorce. And that requires a lot of discussion around assets and division of assets. What we typically don't focus on nearly as deep as we need to is the kids. Because in order to get divorced, we have to divide the assets, but we're not dividing the kids. So, but essentially that's what happens to the kids when those discussions don't happen. So I am a huge fan of the BEH2O model. I think it's really critical because not every parent's going to agree. Sometimes, the reason for the divorce is the parents have different parenting styles. And I think that's where that model comes into play to help parents move forward and still do what's best for their kids, even if they're not in agreement on everything. So, I think that's really where the magic happens. The focus typically is on distribution of assets, but the magic happens when you have a greater and a longer term plan. And I like to use the analogy of a GPS. So, typically the first address that's put in is division of assets. And then the next address that gets put into the GPS is the kids.
Well,
And then
it's so interesting because in my personal case, the first thing we were able to accomplish was deciding on a shared parenting schedule because we decided to nest, and we nested before the divorce was even close to final. Like, we nested for 18 months and we still had another 18 months before we were actually divorced. So the nesting was really important to get on paper. And what I think happened was we got the logistics, but we didn't actually develop any kind of communication plan. And that's a big aha moment I've had in this work as a divorce coach. We need to develop that communication plan. And that's part of what we do in the prep work leading up to 3-day divorce and in the exit work when we talk about what happens next as you start the next chapter of your journey.
Yeah. I love the idea of nesting. And, I think
We
that
should define
really
it.
helps kids.
Tell everybody
So,
what nesting is.
what nesting is, it's if, you keep the kids in the marital house, and then, each parent on their own parenting time is they're with the kids. And when they're not, they're somewhere else. In my particular case, we got a 2-bedroom apartment, and I had a room and she had a room, and we would, each one of us, when we were with the kids, we'd go back to the house. Nesting is very expensive. But I will say, with my own kids, because the divorce took so long during that separated period, it gave the kids time to adjust. And I think it really helped.
Yeah.
So,
And
it's
nesting can be anything. So like, we didn't have a shared apartment and we didn't ask each other where we went on our off nights. My parents were close by. I don't know where he was. And I just left that information a mystery because that was the best for us at that moment. But I don't want people to think that nesting is only available if you have a lot of resources, because it can be the right thing for the beginning of your divorce process.
that is true. And, I think one of the biggest points is when you decide to separate, their business is no longer your business, as far as what they do in their personal life, unless it really affects your kids or it, affects your assets. So super important,
Yeah.
and that's, there's a big release of one another at the end of the 3-day divorce retreat. And, we hope, and it's our expectations, that each spouse will release the other spouse to be able to live their best possible life going
Mhm.
forward. And that
Yeah,
takes a lot of pressure off, one another.
it does. I mean, that's really powerful. And we're going to talk about that ritual in another episode because the 3-day divorce is coming in 2026. So, Justin, before we leave, tell us a little bit about the calendar and also then tell my audience how they can find you.
Okay, absolutely. So, as far as us announcing it, I guess now it's officially announced, and we're going to start doing our marketing. We're going to be doing a virtual 3-day divorce program in January or February, and then we're going to do a in-person 3-day divorce retreat in March of 2026. So we're super excited about that. If you want to find out more information, you can contact me or Lisa. My information, my email is justin at reclaimandreboot.me, or you can go to the website, www.reclaimandreboot.me, and book some time with me, and I can tell you more about it. And then Lisa will share her information. And we're really excited about this.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. For my audience, you could find me at Lisa at lzlcoaching.com. And you can go right to my website, lzlcoaching.com, and book a complimentary 30-minute consult, and we can talk about it if this is something you're interested in. I know it's hard to think about it if you're the only one listening right now, but if you're in that phase and you think that you and your spouse have a similar goal, that you don't want to make this a war of the roses, then a 3-day divorce could be exactly the right thing for you. So with that, I'm going to thank Justin again, Justin Milrad, for joining us. And I'll see you next time on Dishing on Divorce.
Bye, everyone.